The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed across the rugged Montana landscape as blood bloomed across Preston Cole's chest, his body jerking backward before plummeting from the saddle of his chestnut mare. The last thing he registered was the pale blue sky spinning above him, the distant mountains blurring as consciousness slipped away like water through cupped hands. A burning sensation seared down Preston's throat, yanking him violently back to life. His eyes flew open as liquid fire scorched its way down his gullet, forcing a ragged gasp from his lips followed by a cough that sent daggers of pain through his entire torso. "There you are," a woman's voice said, sounding both relieved and cautious. "Thought I'd lost you for a minute." Preston struggled to focus his vision, blinking against the harsh sunlight that filtered through what appeared to be the canvas roof of a small tent. When his sight finally cleared, he found himself staring into the most striking hazel eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a woman with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical but messy braid, her freckled face pinched with concern as she tilted a bottle of whiskey toward his lips again. "Easy now," she murmured. "Just a little more to take the edge off while I finish patching you up." Preston tried to speak but managed only a hoarse whisper. Who are you?" "Penelope Nash," she answered, setting aside the bottle to dab at his forehead with a damp cloth. "Most folks call me Penny." She worked with practiced efficiency, her sleeves rolled up revealing slender but strong arms. "And you're the fool who rode straight into Blackwater Canyon without checking for Carson's men first." The mention of Carson sent a jolt of memory through Preston's foggy mind. William Carson, the cattle baron who'd been systematically forcing smaller ranchers off their land throughout the territory since 1872. Preston had been tracking Carson's operations for the better part of 6 months, gathering evidence of his illegal activities for the federal marshal in Helena. "What year is it?" Preston asked weakly, realizing he might have been unconscious longer than he thought. Penny's eyebrows rose in concern. "Still 1873, mister. You've been out for about 7 hours, not 7 years." She placed a cool hand against his forehead. "Bullet took a nasty path through your shoulder, just missed anything vital. You're lucky I was gathering herbs in the canyon when Carson's boys ambushed you." Preston tried to sit up but fell back with a groan as pain lanced through his left shoulder and chest. "My horse." A shadow passed over Penny's face. "I'm sorry. Your mare took a bullet too, didn't make it." She busied herself mixing something in a small bowl beside what Preston now recognized as a pallet of blankets spread on the ground inside a small trapper's tent. "I managed to grab your saddlebags before Carson's men circled back, but they took your rifle and revolver." "Damn," Preston muttered, the loss of his faithful mare hitting harder than the pain from his wound. "Had that horse since she was a filly." Penny nodded solemnly. "It's a harsh country. Death comes quick out here." There was something in her voice, a familiar intimacy with loss that made Preston study her more carefully. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, dressed in a practical cotton shirt and riding skirt that had seen better days. A leather belt around her waist held a small holstered revolver and various pouches. Her hands, though feminine in shape, bore the calluses and small scars of someone well acquainted with hard work and survival. "You live out here alone?" he asked, wincing as she applied a pungent-smelling poultice to his wound. "Got a small claim about 2 miles east," she replied, wrapping a clean bandage around his shoulder with practiced movements. 20 acres, a cabin, and a stream with enough water for my garden and the 2 horses I keep." "It's not much, but it's mine." Preston nodded, understanding all too well the value of having something to call your own in this untamed territory. "I appreciate the rescue, Miss Nash. Most folks would have just left a stranger to die." "I'm not most folks," she said simply, securing the bandage with a neat knot. "Besides, anyone Carson's men try to kill is probably worth saving in my book." Preston managed a weak smile despite the pain. "Name's Preston Cole. I ride for Judge Harrington out of Helena. Was gathering evidence on Carson's operations when they spotted me." Penny's eyes widened slightly. A lawman, not exactly, Preston clarified. More of a private investigator. The judge hired me after Carson's land grab left 3 families dead last winter. Federal marshals can't move against him without proof. And you have this proof? Penny asked, her voice suddenly tense. Preston's hand instinctively moved to his chest, feeling for the leather pouch he kept tucked in his shirt. Relief washed over him when he found it still there. Some. Enough to start building a case. He looked around the small tent. Where exactly are we? Hidden Valley, about 4 miles from where you were shot, Penny explained, packing away her medical supplies. I couldn't take you back to my cabin, too risky if they're still searching. This is an old trapper's camp I use sometimes when gathering herbs. She glanced toward the tent flap. We should be safe for the night, but come morning we'll need to move. Carson's men don't give up easy. Preston nodded, then grimaced as another wave of pain washed over him. Sounds like you've had your own troubles with Carson. Something flickered in Penny's eyes, a mix of anger and old pain. You could say that. 2 years ago, my father refused to sell our claim to Carson, said the land had been in our family since before Montana was even a territory. She paused, her hands stilling on the medical supplies. 3 days later, he was found dead in the creek. Sheriff called it an accident, said he must have slipped. Pa was the surest-footed man I ever knew. The bitterness in her voice told Preston everything he needed to know. I'm sorry about your father. Penny nodded tightly. Carson's been trying to run me off the land ever since, poisoned my well once, slaughtered one of my horses another time, but I'm still here. She straightened her shoulders with quiet determination. This land is all I have left of my family. I won't give it up. As twilight deepened outside the tent, Penny lit a small lantern, careful to shield most of its light. They kept their voices low, mindful that Carson's men might still be scouring the area. Preston drifted in and out of consciousness as fever began to set in, the infection from his wound battling against Penny's herbal remedies. Through the haze of pain and fever, Preston was aware of Penny's constant presence, her cool hands on his forehead, the gentle pressure as she changed his bandages, the soft murmur of her voice as she coaxed him to drink more water or broth. When the fever peaked in the darkest hours before dawn, he thought he felt her hand holding his, anchoring him to life as delirium threatened to drag him under. Stay with me, Preston, she whispered fiercely when his breathing grew labored. You still have work to do. Carson needs to pay for what he's done. Whether it was her words or the stubborn will to survive that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work, Preston fought his way back from the brink. By morning, the fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. Penny's face showed the strain of her night's vigil, dark circles beneath her eyes as she helped him sit up and drink some coffee she'd brewed over a tiny, smokeless fire. You're tougher than you look, she remarked, a note of respect in her voice. Most men would have been meeting their maker after losing that much blood. Preston managed a wry smile. Had worse. Apache arrow through my leg near Tucson in '68. French Henry's daughter dug it out with nothing but a hunting knife and half a bottle of rye whiskey to dull the pain. Sounds like you make a habit of getting yourself shot and relying on women to patch you up, Penny observed with a raised eyebrow. Seems that way, Preston admitted, attempting to move his injured arm and immediately regretting it. Though I usually try to be more charming about it. A ghost of a smile touched Penny's lips before she returned to her practical concerns. We need to move soon. I've been hearing horses in the distance all morning. Preston nodded, already steeling himself for the pain that movement would bring. How far to your cabin? About 2 hours at the pace you'll be able to manage, she replied, already packing up her supplies. We'll have to stick to the tree line and ravines. Avoid the main trails completely. By mid-morning, they had struck camp, leaving no trace of their presence. Preston struggled onto the spare horse. Penny had brought a sturdy, calm gelding that seemed unbothered by his awkward mounting and unsteady seat. Every step of the horse sent waves of pain through his injured shoulder, but he clenched his jaw and focused on the landscape around them. noting landmarks and potential danger spots from habit. Penny led them through a meandering route that showed her intimate knowledge of the terrain, shallow creek beds that left no tracks, rocky outcroppings that provided cover, dense stands of pine that shielded them from view. She moved with the natural confidence of someone raised in the wilderness, her senses constantly alert. "How long have you lived out here?" Preston asked during a brief rest, partly out of curiosity and partly to distract himself from the pain. "All my life," Penny answered, scanning the horizon as she spoke. "Pa brought Ma out here from St. Louis when I was just a baby. She died of fever when I was 8. A shadow crossed her face. "Pa raised me to hunt, trap, and track as good as any man." Said a woman alone in these territories needed those skills more than fancy manners. "Smart man," Preston commented, noting how she positioned herself with clear sightlines in all directions, a habit he recognized from his own training. "He was," she agreed simply. "What about you?" "You don't strike me as Montana-born." Preston shifted carefully in the saddle. "Born in Boston, father was a professor, had my life all mapped out: university, law practice, politics." He gave a short laugh. "War changed everything. After Gettysburg, couldn't stomach the thought of sitting behind a desk arguing points of law while the country was tearing itself apart." "So you came west," Penny surmised. "Eventually. Worked as a Pinkerton for a while after the war. Came out to Montana in '69 when the railroad was pushing through. Judge Harrington was having trouble with claim jumpers and hired me to investigate." He shrugged his good shoulder. "Found I had a knack for this kind of work, been doing it ever since." They fell silent as they approached a steeper section of terrain. Preston could see Penny weighing their options, clearly concerned about his ability to navigate the difficult path. "I can make it," he assured her, reading her expression. "I've ridden with worse." She looked skeptical but nodded. "The shorter path means less time exposed. Follow exactly where I lead. There's an old mine shaft with a false bottom about halfway up that ravine. One wrong step and you'll drop 30 feet. The next hour tested the limits of Preston's endurance as they picked their way across increasingly rugged terrain. Twice, they froze at the distant sound of voices, pressing themselves against rock faces until the danger passed. By the time the small cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of pines with a clear stream running nearby, Preston was lightheaded from pain and exertion. Penny's homestead was modest, but well-maintained, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a small corral for her horses, and visible signs of the garden she'd mentioned. Everything about the place spoke of practicality and hard work. "It's not much," she said, almost defensively as she helped him dismount. "It's freedom," Preston replied simply, understanding immediately why she fought so hard to keep it. Something in his tone made her look at him sharply, a moment of recognition passing between them, two people who understood the value of independence and the high cost it sometimes demanded. Inside, the cabin was clean and orderly, with a small collection of books on rough-hewn shelves that suggested Penny valued education despite her frontier life. She helped Preston to the single bed in the corner, ignoring his protests that he could make do on the floor. "Don't be foolish," she said firmly. "That wound needs proper tending, and you're in no condition to sleep on hard planks. I've bunked down by the fire plenty of times." Too exhausted to argue, Preston sank onto the bed, his body finally surrendering to the demands of healing. The last thing he remembered was Penny covering him with a patchwork quilt, her touch gentle despite the strength in her hands. He woke hours later to the smell of cooking and the soft glow of lamplight. Night had fallen, and Penny was stirring something in a pot over the fire. When she realized he was awake, she brought him a cup of water and checked his bandages with businesslike efficiency. "Fever's staying away," she noted with satisfaction. "Wounds clean. You'll live to chase outlaws another day, Mr. Cole." "Preston," he corrected, his voice stronger than before. "After you've saved a man's life and given up your bed for him, I think first names are warranted." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Preston, then." She hesitated, then added, "Though most folks who know me well call me Penny." "Penny," he repeated, liking the way it felt. "Thank you." "For everything." She brushed aside his gratitude, turning back to the stew. "You'd have done the same for anyone." "Not everyone would," Preston countered. "This territory breeds hard men and women who look after themselves first. Kindness to strangers isn't common." Penny was quiet for a moment as she ladled stew into 2 bowls. "Maybe I've seen enough cruelty to value its opposite," she finally said, handing him a bowl. "Eat. You need your strength." The stew was hearty and well-seasoned, made with what appeared to be rabbit and wild onions. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and occasional whinny from the horses outside the only sounds disturbing the night. "Tomorrow I need to get word to Judge Harrington," Preston said eventually. "Let him know what happened and that I have evidence against Carson." Penny set down her bowl, her expression turning serious. "Carson's men will be watching all the trails to Helena, and the telegraph operator in Copper Creek works for Carson. Nothing gets sent without him knowing about it." Preston frowned, considering their limited options. "Is there anyone in town you trust, someone who could carry a message?" "There's old Dr. Jennings," Penny said after a moment's thought. "He delivered me and was a friend to my father. Carson hasn't managed to buy or scare him yet." She hesitated. "But you're still not strong enough to travel, and I can't leave you here alone." "I can manage," Preston insisted, though they both knew it was bravado more than reality. Penny shook her head firmly. 3 days. Give your body 3 days to start healing properly, and then we'll figure out how to get your evidence to the judge." Preston wanted to argue but knew she was right. In his current condition, he'd be easy prey for Carson's men, and he'd only put Penny in more danger. Reluctantly, he nodded his agreement. The next 3 days established a rhythm between them. Penny tended to Preston's wound, prepared meals, and saw to the daily chores of her small homestead while Preston gradually regained his strength. When he was able to sit up for longer periods, he helped clean her small collection of firearms and sharpen tools, tasks that required minimal movement but allowed him to feel useful. In the evenings, they talked. Preston told her about his years tracking outlaws across the Montana and Dakota territories, the colorful characters he'd encountered, and the changing face of the West as railroads and settlements pushed ever farther into once wild lands. Penny shared stories of her father, her knowledge of local plants and their medicinal properties, and her occasional trips into Copper Creek for supplies and news. On the morning of the 4th day, Preston woke before dawn, the pain in his shoulder reduced to a dull ache. He found himself listening to the soft sounds of Penny moving about the cabin, preparing coffee and stoking the fire. There was something profoundly comforting in her presence, a steadiness and quiet strength that he had come to admire deeply in their short time together. When she turned and caught him watching her, something passed between them, an awareness that transcended their circumstances, a recognition of something neither had been looking for but had found nonetheless. "How's the shoulder today?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. "Better," Preston replied, holding her gaze. "Thanks to your care." A faint blush colored her cheeks as she brought him coffee. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither rushed to break the contact. The moment was interrupted by the distant but unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Penny's head snapped up, her expression immediately alert. "Get up," she said urgently, already moving to the window. "Carson's men, at least 4 riders coming up the main trail." Preston was on his feet instantly, ignoring the protest from his injured shoulder as he reached for his gun belt, then remembered his weapons had been taken. Penny was already pulling a Winchester rifle from above the door and checking its load. "There's a trapdoor under the rug by the fireplace," she said, her voice calm despite the danger. "Root cellar beneath. Take your evidence and hide there." Preston shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone. This isn't the time for foolish heroics," Penny snapped. "You're injured, and that evidence is the only chance of stopping Carson legally. If they find you here, we're both dead, and no one will ever bring him to justice." The logic of her argument was irrefutable, but still Preston hesitated. "Penny, please," she said, her voice softening for just a moment. "I know how to handle them. They've been here before. I'll convince them I haven't seen you." The sound of the horses was closer now, leaving no time for further argument. With reluctant efficiency, Preston grabbed his saddlebags and the leather pouch containing his notes and witness statements. Penny pulled back the rug, revealing a small trapdoor that opened onto a narrow ladder descending into darkness. "There's a false wall at the back," she whispered as he climbed down. "If they insist on searching, get behind it. And Preston," she paused, their eyes meeting one last time, "stay alive. That's all that matters right now." Before he could respond, she closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug. Seconds later, he heard the cabin door open and Penny's voice calling out a greeting that sounded remarkably casual given the circumstances. "Morning, gentlemen. What brings Carson's men to my humble home this early?" A deep voice responded, its tone falsely pleasant. "Miss Nash." "Looking lovelier than ever." "Save the flattery, Roberts," Penny replied coolly. "What do you want?" Preston crept toward the false wall Penny had mentioned, finding it cleverly disguised as part of the root cellar's natural stone foundation. As he positioned himself behind it, he could still hear the conversation above, though muffled by the floorboards. "Just being neighborly," Roberts was saying. "Checking on our favorite stubborn homesteader. Boss still thinks you should reconsider his offer for this land." "My answer hasn't changed in 2 years," Penny replied. "This land isn't for sale." "Things change, Miss Nash," another voice interjected. "Territory's growing, progress is coming whether folks like you want it or not. Is threatening lone women what passes for progress these days?" Penny's voice remained steady, showing no fear despite being outnumbered. "No threats today," Roberts said smoothly. "But we are looking for someone. Stranger riding through Blackwater Canyon a few days back. Got himself shot but might have survived. Dark hair, about 6 foot, carrying saddlebags that might contain some papers Mr. Carson is concerned about." "Haven't seen any strangers," Penny answered immediately. "Been keeping to myself like always." There was a pause and Preston could imagine the men exchanging glances, weighing her words. "Mind if we look around?" Roberts asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Just to be sure." "My home isn't open to Carson's thugs," Penny replied, an edge entering her voice. "You want to search my property, come back with the sheriff and a warrant." Preston heard heavy footsteps moving across the cabin floor, and a new voice spoke harder and crueler than the others. "You always were too mouthy for your own good, Nash. Just like your pa before Carson's boys shut him up for good." There was a sudden commotion, the sound of a scuffle, something crashing to the floor. Preston's hand instinctively went to his hip where his gun should have been, every instinct screaming at him to go to Penny's aid. But he forced himself to remain still, knowing that revealing himself now would only make things worse for both of them. "Get your hands off me," Penny's voice rang out, anger replacing fear. "Or what?" the cruel voice taunted. "You'll scream. Ain't nobody out here to hear you, girl." "That's enough, Delaney," Roberts interrupted, sounding uncomfortable. "We're just here to look for the stranger." "And I'm just getting acquainted with Miss Nash," Delaney replied, a nasty edge to his voice. Maybe she'll be more cooperative after the rest of his sentence was cut off by a sharp crack that Preston recognized immediately as the sound of a gun being fired indoors. There were shouts of surprise, a heavy thud, and then Robert's voice, high with shock. "Jesus Christ, Nash. You shot Delaney." "He put his hands on me," Penny replied coldly. "Next one who tries gets the same. Now get him out of my home." There was shuffling and grunting as the men apparently dragged their wounded companion outside. Preston could hear raised voices from the yard, some arguing for retaliation, others urging retreat. Robert's voice eventually rose above the others. "This isn't over, Nash. Carson will hear about this. Tell him he's welcome to come himself next time," Penny called back. "Instead of sending cowards who manhandle women." The sound of horses galloping away followed, and then silence. Preston waited, heart pounding, until he heard the trapdoor being opened. "They're gone," Penny said, her face appearing at the opening. "For now." Preston climbed up quickly, assessing her for injuries. She seemed physically unharmed, though her shirt was torn at the shoulder and her eyes blazed with residual anger and fear. On the cabin floor, a dark stain of blood marked where Delaney had fallen. "Are you all right?" Preston asked urgently, taking her hands in his without thinking. Penny nodded, though a slight tremor ran through her body. "It's not the first time Carson's men have tried to intimidate me, but it is the first time I've shot one of them." She looked down at the bloodstain. "I aimed for his leg." "He'll live, unfortunately." "You were incredible," Preston said, genuine admiration in his voice. "But they'll be back and in greater numbers next time." "I know," Penny agreed grimly. "Shooting Delaney changes everything. Carson can't let it stand without losing face with his men." She moved away from Preston, pacing the small cabin as she thought. "We need to leave today. They'll expect me to run, but not immediately. If we move quickly, we might get a head start." Preston nodded, already mentally calculating what they would need. "How far to Helena from here?" 3 days hard ride under normal circumstances," Penny replied, gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. "But we'll need to avoid the main trails completely. Could take twice as long." "We don't have to make it all the way to Helena," Preston said, checking the contents of his saddlebags. "Just far enough to find someone trustworthy who can get a message to Judge Harrington. Once he knows I have evidence against Carson, he'll send marshals." Penny paused in her preparations, a troubled expression crossing her face. "And then what? Carson has friends in high places." "Even with your evidence, there's no guarantee he'll face justice." "It's a start," Preston insisted. "Better than nothing." "And what about after?" she pressed. "Carson's men know your face now, they'll hunt you, and they'll certainly burn my place to the ground the moment we're gone." The reality of their situation hung heavy between them. Whatever happened, Penny's life as she had known it was effectively over. The home she had fought so hard to keep would likely be ashes within days. Preston crossed to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Penny." "This is my fault. If I hadn't been shot near your land, no," she interrupted firmly. "Carson was always going to come for my land eventually. At least this way we have a chance to see him pay for what he's done, to my father, to the others." She looked up at Preston, determination replacing the momentary doubt. "I've spent 2 years waiting for justice. If leaving this place behind is the price, so be it." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deeper understanding, a shared purpose that transcended their brief acquaintance. Almost without thinking, Preston leaned down and kissed her, a gentle press of lips that carried a promise neither had spoken aloud. When they parted, Penny's eyes were wide with surprise, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "I shouldn't have done that," Preston said softly. "No," she agreed, a small smile touching her lips. "But I'm glad you did." The moment was interrupted by the practical demands of their escape. With renewed focus, they gathered only what was essential: food, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies for Preston's still healing wound. Penny took a few personal items: a locket containing a faded photograph of her parents, her father's pocket watch, the small collection of books that had been her mother's. As she prepared to close the cabin door for what might be the last time, Preston saw her hesitate, her hand lingering on the rough-hewn wood. "We'll come back," he said, though they both knew it might be a lie. "Once Carson is dealt with, rebuild if necessary." Penny nodded, though her eyes held the knowledge that some chapters, once closed, could never truly be reopened. "Let's go," she said simply, turning away from the only home she had ever known. They rode hard through the morning, taking game trails and dried creek beds that wouldn't leave obvious tracks. Penny led them on a circuitous route that confused even Preston's experienced sense of direction up rocky slopes where hoofprints wouldn't show. Through stands of pine so dense, they had to dismount and lead the horses, across shallow stretches of fast-moving streams that would wash away any scent. By mid-afternoon, they had covered perhaps 15 miles as the crow flies, though their actual path had been twice that distance. Preston's shoulder throbbed with renewed pain from the exertion, but he refused to slow their pace. Every mile between them and Carson's men increased their chances of survival. They made camp in a hidden box canyon as dusk approached, choosing a position that offered both concealment and a clear escape route if needed. As Penny prepared a cold supper, they dared not risk a fire. Preston took stock of their weapons: Penny's Winchester rifle, her revolver, and a hunting knife she'd given him from her supplies. Modest armament against what would likely be a well-equipped search party. "We should reach Miller's Crossing by tomorrow evening if we maintain this pace," Penny said, passing him a strip of jerky and some dried fruit. "There's a station master there named Hollister who was friendly with my father. If anyone will help get a message to your judge, it's him." Preston nodded, calculating distances in his head. "If Hollister can get word to Helena immediately, the marshals could intercept us on the trail within 2 days." "That's assuming Carson's men don't find us first," Penny reminded him, practical as always. They ate in silence for a while, conserving their energy and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness around them. Despite the danger of their situation, Preston found himself appreciating the wild beauty of the Montana territory bathed in moonlight, and even more so, the remarkable woman sitting across from him. In just a few days, Penny Nash had upended every notion Preston had about his solitary life. He had spent years drifting from one assignment to the next, forming no lasting connections, married only to his work and the cause of justice. Now, facing the very real possibility that they might not survive this pursuit, he found himself regretting all the things he might never have the chance to say to her. "What are you thinking about?" Penny asked softly, interrupting his thoughts. Preston looked at her in the dim moonlight, her copper hair appearing almost silver, her eyes bright with intelligence and quiet courage. "That I'm glad it was you who found me in that canyon," he admitted, "even with everything that's happened since." A small smile touched her lips. "Most women might have just left you there, you know, especially after checking your pockets and finding nothing worth stealing." "Did you check my pockets before or after pouring whiskey down my throat?" Preston asked, feigning offense. "During," Penny replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. "I'm practical that way." They both laughed quietly, the shared moment of levity precious in the midst of their precarious circumstances. "We should get some rest," Penny eventually said, her expression turning serious again. "Dawn comes early and we need to be moving before first light." They arranged their bedrolls close together both for warmth and security, taking turns keeping watch throughout the night. During Preston's second shift, as the moon set and the darkest hour before dawn settled over the canyon, he found himself watching Penny sleep. The fierce, capable woman who had faced down Carson's men with a rifle looked almost vulnerable in slumber, her face relaxed and younger somehow. An unfamiliar protective instinct surged through him, along with a determination that went beyond his professional commitment to bringing Carson to justice. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he would ensure that Penny Nash had a future even if he wasn't part of it. Dawn broke with a thin mist rising from the canyon floor, providing additional cover as they struck camp and prepared to move out. Penny's knowledge of the terrain continued to impress Preston, as she led them through a series of hidden ravines and passes that kept them concealed from any eyes watching the more obvious trails. By mid-morning, however, both were aware of a subtle change in the forest around them, birds falling silent too quickly, the sense of being watched from the dense trees flanking their path. "We're being tracked," Preston murmured, keeping his voice low as they picked their way along a narrow ridge. Penny nodded almost imperceptibly. "Since about an hour back, 2 riders, maybe 3, staying just out of sight. Carson's men, most likely," she replied, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead, "though they're being cautious, not the usual bull-headed approach his thugs take." They pressed on, increasing their pace where the terrain allowed it, both aware that their pursuers were gradually closing the distance. When they reached a fork in the trail shortly before noon, Penny pulled her horse up short, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Left leads to more open country," she explained quietly. "Faster travel but less cover. Right takes us deeper into the mountains, slower going but harder to track." Preston considered their options. "How much farther to Miller's Crossing?" "About 18 miles if we take the left fork." "Nearly 30 if we go right." "And if Carson's men catch up to us in open country?" Penny's hand moved unconsciously to the rifle slung across her back. 2 against 3 aren't terrible odds, unless they have more men waiting ahead." Preston made his decision. "We take the right fork." "Better to arrive late than not at all." Penny nodded agreement, already turning her horse toward the mountain path. They had gone less than half a mile when the first gunshot rang out, splintering bark from a tree just inches from Preston's head. "Ride," he shouted, spurring his horse forward as Penny did the same. They galloped recklessly along the narrow trail, ducking low over their horses' necks as more shots echoed through the forest behind them. The path climbed steeply, switchbacking up the mountainside with perilous drops on one side and solid rock face on the other, offering no cover, but making it difficult for their pursuers to get a clear shot. When they reached a small plateau about halfway up the mountain, Penny suddenly veered off the trail, leading them into what appeared to be a solid wall of brush and pine. "Follow close," she called back to Preston, ducking low as her horse plunged through the foliage. Preston did as instructed, his horse snorting in protest as branches whipped at its face. To his amazement, the seemingly impenetrable vegetation gave way to reveal a hidden path, narrow and overgrown but definitely man-made. "Old mining trail," Penny explained breathlessly as they continued at a quick trot. "Most folks don't know it's here. My father showed me when I was young." The trail wound through dense forest for nearly a mile before opening onto another plateau, this one featuring the crumbling remains of a mining operation, a collapsed shaft entrance, rotting timbers, and rusted equipment scattered among the rocks. "We can make a stand here if needed," Penny said, dismounting quickly and leading her horse behind the remains of a small ore processing building. "They'll have to come through the same passage we did single file." Preston followed her lead, tying their horses in a position where they could easily be reached if a quick escape became necessary. His shoulder protested as he drew the hunting knife, wishing for the familiar weight of his revolver instead. "Here," Penny said, noting his predicament. She pulled a small derringer from her boot and handed it to him. "Only 2 shots, but better than nothing." Preston nodded his thanks, checking the load by habit. "How far behind do you think they are?" "Minutes," Penny replied grimly, positioning herself behind a large boulder with her rifle ready. "They'll be cautious approaching the hidden trail, but once they find it." They didn't have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes later, the sound of horses moving slowly through underbrush reached them, followed by low voices as their pursuers discovered the concealed path. "I count 3 voices," Preston whispered, straining to hear. "Maybe a 4th." Penny nodded, her face set in lines of determined concentration. "Let them get clear of the trees before we engage. Better sight lines." Preston positioned himself about 20 yards from Penny, giving them crossfire capability while ensuring that if one position was discovered, the other might remain hidden. The tension mounted as the sounds of approach grew louder, then fell silent, their pursuers apparently dismounting before the final approach. The first man emerged from the tree line cautiously, rifle raised, scanning the plateau methodically. Preston recognized him immediately as Roberts, the leader of the group that had visited Penny's cabin. 2 more men followed, spreading out to cover more ground as they advanced toward the mining ruins. "No sign of them," one of the men called. "Horses probably continued up the main trail." "Check the ruins anyway," Roberts ordered. "Nash knows these mountains. Could be trying to throw us off." The men moved forward now within 50 yards of Preston's position. He glanced toward Penny, who gave a barely perceptible nod, the signal they had agreed upon. Taking careful aim with the Derringer, Preston squeezed the trigger. The shot caught the leftmost man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a shout of pain and surprise. Before the others could react, Penny's rifle cracked, dropping Roberts with a wound to his thigh. "Cover!" The third man shouted, diving behind a pile of rocks as both his companions lay injured in the open. Preston had one bullet left in the Derringer, a weapon designed for close quarters, not the distance that now separated him from their adversaries. He watched as the unwounded man began laying down covering fire, allowing Roberts to drag himself behind an old ore cart. "Nash," Roberts shouted between gunshots. "We just want the evidence Cole's carrying. Hand it over and we'll let you both ride out of here, like you let my father ride out." Penny called back, her voice tight with controlled fury. "That was business," Roberts replied. "This is too. Carson's offering $500 for those papers, and he's willing to forget about you shooting Delaney." Preston caught Penny's eye across the distance between them, a silent question passing between them. She shook her head firmly. Neither of them believed Roberts' offer for a moment. "Here's my counter-offer," Preston shouted. "Throw down your weapons and ride back to Carson. Tell him Judge Harrington will have federal marshals at his door within the week. If he surrenders himself now, he might avoid the hangman's noose." A burst of gunfire was the only response, bullets pinging off the rocks around both their positions. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, occasional shots exchanged, but neither side gaining advantage. Preston was acutely aware of their limited ammunition. Penny had perhaps 20 rounds for the rifle, and his Derringer held just one remaining bullet. The situation changed abruptly when a new voice called from the direction of the hidden trail. "Roberts, where are you, you son of a bitch?" Preston's blood ran cold at the sound, rough, angry, and unmistakably belonging to Delaney, the man Penny had shot back at her cabin. He should have been incapacitated by his wound, yet somehow he had joined the pursuit. "Over here," Roberts called back. "They've got us pinned down." Preston watched in growing alarm as a fourth figure emerged from the tree-lined Delaney, moving with a pronounced limp but very much active, a shotgun cradled in his arms and murder in his eyes. "Nash," he bellowed. "I owe you for my leg, you bitch." The situation had deteriorated dramatically. With Delaney's arrival, they were now facing two injured but determined men and two who were unharmed. Worse, the shotgun he carried could devastate their cover at close range. Preston looked toward Penny, trying to communicate their increasingly desperate circumstances. She nodded once, understanding passing between them without words. They needed to move immediately or risk being outflanked and overwhelmed. Keeping low, Preston worked his way backward toward where their horses were tied. Penny provided covering fire, the crack of her rifle forcing their adversaries to keep their heads down. When he reached the horses, Preston untied them both, leading them to a position where Penny could mount quickly when the moment came. Their opportunity arrived when Delaney, impatient and driven by vengeance, broke cover and charged toward what he thought was Penny's position, shotgun raised. Penny had already moved, however, and her rifle spoke once more, the bullet striking Delaney in his already wounded leg. He went down with a howl of pain and rage. "Now," Preston called, holding Penny's horse steady as she ran in a crouched sprint across the open ground between them. She vaulted into the saddle with practiced ease, and they spurred their mounts toward a narrow trail that led higher into the mountains, away from the mining ruins. Gunfire followed them, bullets whining overhead, but distance and the difficult terrain soon put them beyond effective range. They rode hard for nearly an hour, pushing their horses to the limits of endurance on the treacherous mountain paths. When they finally slowed to rest the winded animals, both were breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through their systems. "That was too close," Penny gasped, scanning the trail behind them. "If Delaney hadn't broken cover when he did." "But he did," Preston replied, checking his mount for any injuries sustained during their flight. His rage made him careless. It probably saved our lives. Penny nodded grimly. He won't make the same mistake twice, and now they know we're heading into the high country, not toward Miller's Crossing. Preston considered their options, none of them particularly promising. Could we circle back, take a different route to Miller's Crossing? Possible, Penny said thoughtfully. There's an old trapper's path that cuts across the ridge about 2 miles ahead. It would add half a day to our journey, but it might throw them off our trail. Half a day is better than not making it at all, Preston decided. Lead on. As they continued higher into the mountains, the air grew noticeably cooler, and the vegetation changed from the mixed pine forest of the lower elevations to more stunted, weather-beaten growth. The views were spectacular rolling mountains stretching to the horizon in every direction, valleys filled with mist, distant peaks still capped with snow even in summer. Under different circumstances, Preston might have found the journey almost pleasant, especially with Penny as his guide. Her knowledge of the land was comprehensive, and she moved through the wilderness with a natural grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in these mountains. They reached the trapper's path Penny had mentioned just as the afternoon sun began its westward descent. The trail was little more than a game track in places, requiring them to dismount and lead their horses across particularly treacherous sections where loose shale threatened to slide away beneath their feet. We should make camp soon, Penny advised as they navigated a difficult stretch. The light will be gone within 2 hours, and this isn't terrain you want to travel in darkness. Preston agreed, though concern over their pursuers made him reluctant to stop. Think we've put enough distance between us and Carson's men. For tonight, Penny replied, though uncertainty tinged her voice. They'll be slowed by their wounded, and they might expect us to continue through the night, pushing to reach Miller's Crossing. So we rest now and make our move at first light, Preston surmised. Penny nodded. There's a sheltered hollow about half a mile ahead. Good water source, natural protection from the wind, and only one approach. We can take turns keeping watch. The hollow proved to be an excellent campsite, a small depression ringed by weathered boulders and stunted pine, with a clear spring bubbling up from the rocky ground at its center. They unsaddled the tired horses and secured them where they could graze on the sparse mountain vegetation, then set about preparing a cold camp, still unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted by their pursuers. As they shared the last of Penny's jerky and dried fruit, the temperature dropped rapidly with the setting sun, reminding them of the harsh realities of mountain weather even in summer. They sat close together, sharing a blanket for warmth as darkness settled around them. "Tell me about your home in Boston," Penny said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The life you left behind." Preston was surprised by the question but found himself answering readily. "Beacon Hill. Big house, always full of my father's academic colleagues arguing about philosophy and politics." He smiled at the memory. "My mother hosted musicales every Thursday evening. She played the piano beautifully. Expected me to follow my father into academia. Was horrified when I joined the Union Army instead. Do they know that you're out here?" Penny asked softly. Preston shook his head. "Both gone now. Father died during the war. Heart gave out after my brother was killed at Antietam. Mother followed a year later." He stared out into the darkness. "Sometimes I think that's why I keep moving, nothing to go back to." Penny was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "I understand that," she finally said. "After Pa died, the land was all that kept me rooted. Now." Her voice trailed off, the reality of her uncertain future hanging between them. "You could start over," Preston suggested gently. "Anywhere you wanted, Helena maybe, or further west to Oregon or California." "And do what?" Penny asked with a small, sad smile. "I know wilderness and survival, Preston, not much call for those skills in cities." "You underestimate yourself," Preston said, more firmly than he'd intended. "I've never met anyone more capable or adaptable." He hesitated, then added more softly, "or braver." In the dim moonlight filtering through the pines, he saw color rise in Penny's cheeks at the compliment. She looked away, clearly unused to such praise. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "After Carson is brought to justice, what then? Back to tracking outlaws for Judge Harrington?" The question gave Preston pause. Until a few days ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. It was the only life he had known or wanted since coming west. Now, with Penny beside him in the moonlight, other possibilities seemed suddenly within reach. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "For the first time in years, I'm not certain what comes next." Their eyes met in the darkness, an unspoken current of possibility flowing between them. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Preston leaned toward her. This time when their lips met, the kiss was neither brief nor tentative. Penny's arms slid around his neck as she responded with an intensity that matched his own. Years of solitude and self-reliance, momentarily forgotten in the simple human connection they had found in each other. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I wasn't looking for this," he murmured. "Neither was I," Penny replied softly, "but here we are." They settled into a comfortable silence, Penny eventually resting her head against Preston's good shoulder as they watched stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Despite the danger still pursuing them, despite the uncertainty of their future, Preston felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. "I'll take first watch," he said eventually, though reluctant to break the moment between them. "You should get some sleep." Penny nodded, practical as always despite the emotional terrain they had just navigated. "Wake me in 4 hours, and Preston," she touched his face gently, "be careful." He watched as she settled into her bedroll, struck by how quickly she had come to matter to him. The realization brought both joy and fear. Joy at finding such an unexpected connection. Fear at how easily it could be lost in their dangerous circumstances. Determined to keep her safe, Preston positioned himself where he could watch both the approach to their campsite and Penny's sleeping form. The small derringer with its single remaining bullet, a cold comfort against the dangers of the night. His watch passed uneventfully, the mountain night filled only with natural sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the soft nickering of their horses. When it came time to wake Penny for her shift, he found himself reluctant to disturb her peaceful slumber. "You let me sleep too long," she accused softly when he finally roused her, noting the position of the moon. "You needed the rest," Preston replied simply. Penny shook her head in mild exasperation but didn't argue further. As they exchanged positions, her hand lingered on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their relationship. "Sleep well," she whispered, moving to take up her watchful position. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully to Preston. His dreams were troubled images of Carson's men surrounding them, of Penny falling beneath a hail of bullets, of the evidence he carried being consumed by flames. He woke several times, reassured each time by the sight of Penny's silhouette keeping vigilant watch over their small camp. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist that shrouded the mountains in ghostly white, limiting visibility to mere yards in any direction. They broke camp quickly and silently, both aware that the fog was both blessing and curse. It concealed their movements, but might also hide approaching danger until it was too late to react. "The trapper's path follows the ridgeline for another 3 miles, Penny explained as they mounted, her voice barely above a whisper in the stillness. "Then it descends into Elk Valley. From there, it's about 4 hours to Miller's Crossing, assuming we don't run into trouble." Preston nodded, checking that the precious evidence was secure in his saddlebags. "Lead on." They traveled slowly at first, the fog forcing them to navigate carefully along the treacherous mountain path. As the morning progressed, the sun began to burn away the mist, revealing breathtaking vistas of forested slopes and distant peaks. By mid-morning, they had reached the point where the trail began its descent into Elk Valley. the terrain gradually becoming less severe as they left the high country behind. Their spirits lifted as they made good progress without any sign of pursuit. Perhaps Carson's men had continued searching in the wrong direction, or maybe the wounded Roberts and Delaney had slowed them down more than anticipated. Whatever the reason, their luck seemed to be holding. "We might actually make it," Penny said during a brief stop to rest the horses, allowing herself a small smile. Preston wanted to share her optimism but couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. Carson wouldn't give up this easily, not with what's at stake. "Maybe not," Penny conceded. "But even he can't control these mountains. If we're careful, we can still reach Miller's Crossing before the crack of a rifle shot interrupted her, the bullet striking a tree just inches from her head. Instantly, both dove for cover behind nearby rocks as more shots rang out from the forested slope above them. "Ambush!" Preston shouted unnecessarily, pulling Penny closer to the shelter of a large boulder as bullets continued to rain around them. Their horses, panicked by the gunfire, bolted down the trail, carrying their supplies and most critically Preston's saddlebags with the evidence against Carson. "No," Penny gasped, starting to rise as if to chase after the fleeing animals. Preston pulled her back down as another volley of shots kicked up dirt where she would have been standing. "Let them go. We need to focus on surviving right now." Assessing their situation with practiced efficiency, Preston counted at least 3 separate firing positions on the slope above them. They were pinned down with minimal cover, armed only with Penny's Winchester rifle, her revolver, and his nearly useless Derringer with its single remaining bullet. "They must have circled ahead of us during the night," Penny said grimly, checking the ammunition in her rifle. "Probably guessed we'd take this route to Miller's Crossing." Preston nodded, his mind racing through potential strategies. "Can you see any of them clearly enough for a shot?" Penny carefully raised her head just enough to scan the tree line. "Glimpses only." "They've got good positions, lots of cover." A voice called down from the ambush position, confirming Preston's worst fears. "Cole, Nash, throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up. Mr. Carson just wants what's his." "That's Jenkins," Penny whispered. "Carson's foreman. He's even worse than Roberts and Delaney." Preston's jaw tightened. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Their supplies were gone, they were outgunned and outpositioned, and now Carson's most dangerous man was personally leading the ambush. "Last chance, Cole," Jenkins called again. "Surrender now, or we start using dynamite instead of bullets." To emphasize his point, something arced through the air from the tree line, landing about 20 yards from their position with a dull thud. Preston recognized the bundle immediately blasting powder wrapped in oilcloth with a lit fuse sputtering ominously. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Penny's arm and pulling her with him as they abandoned their cover, sprinting laterally along the slope rather than up or down. The explosion came seconds later, showering them with dirt and rock fragments as they dove behind a fallen log. Gunfire immediately followed, bullets splintering wood inches above their heads. "They're trying to flush us into the open," Penny gasped, her face dirt-streaked but determined. Preston nodded, already calculating their dwindling options. "We need to split up," he said grimly. "It's our only chance. I'll draw their fire while you circle behind them." "That's suicide," Penny protested, her eyes flashing with fear and anger. "Not if you can get a clear shot at Jenkins," Preston insisted. "He's their leader. Take him out and the others might falter long enough for us to make a run for it." Another dynamite bundle sailed through the air, landing closer this time. They scrambled away moments before the explosion tore a crater in the earth where they had been sheltering. "There's no time to argue," Preston said urgently, pulling Penny close for one fierce kiss. "I'll head downslope, make as much noise as possible. You move along the ridge, try to get above them. Wait for my signal, I'll fire the Derringer straight up. That's when you take your shot at Jenkins." Penny's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Don't you dare die on me, Preston Cole." "Not planning on it," he replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. See you in Miller's Crossing." Before she could object further, Preston darted from behind the log, firing Penny's revolver randomly upslope as he ran in a zigzag pattern toward the valley floor. As he'd hoped, the ambushers' fire immediately concentrated on him, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels as he dove from cover to cover. From the corner of his eye, he saw Penny moving in the opposite direction, using the distraction he'd created to make her way unnoticed along the ridgeline toward the ambushers' position. Pride surged through him at her courage and skill. If anyone could turn this desperate situation around, it was Penny Nash. For the next several minutes, Preston engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, drawing fire then changing position, keeping the ambushers' attention focused downslope while Penny worked her way behind them. Twice more, dynamite bundles exploded near his position, the blasts leaving his ears ringing and adding to the chaos. When he judged that Penny had had enough time to reach a firing position, Preston took a deep breath, raised the Derringer skyward, and fired the single remaining bullet, the signal they had agreed upon. The response was immediate and devastating. A single crack from Penny's rifle, followed by a shout of pain and surprise from the direction of Jenkins' position. Then another shot, and another, as Penny methodically targeted the remaining ambushers. Using the confusion, Preston charged upslope, Penny's empty revolver still in his hand as if it contained ammunition. He reached the first ambusher, a young man barely out of his teens who clearly hadn't expected a frontal assault, and struck him with the butt of the gun before he could bring his rifle to bear. The young man went down hard, his rifle clattering away down the rocky slope. Preston grabbed it, now properly armed, and continued toward the main ambush position where Jenkins had been directing the attack. He found chaos. Jenkins lay on the ground, clutching a bleeding wound in his shoulder, his face contorted with pain and rage. Two more of Carson's men were scrambling for cover, clearly unprepared for an attack from behind. And there was Penny, moving with the grace of a mountain lion from tree to tree, her rifle finding targets with deadly precision. "It's over, Jenkins." Preston called out, the captured rifle trained on the wounded foreman. "Call off your men," Jenkins spat a curse, his good hand moving toward the revolver at his hip. Preston's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Penny's rifle cracked once more. Jenkins' hand jerked away from his gun, blood streaming from where her bullet had grazed his wrist. "Next one goes through your heart," Penny said coldly, stepping into view with her rifle aimed steadily at Jenkins' chest. "Tell your men to drop their weapons. Now." The authority in her voice was unmistakable. Even in pain and defeat, Jenkins recognized when he was outmatched. "Stand down," he shouted to his remaining men. "Drop your guns." Two rifles clattered to the ground as Carson's men raised their hands in surrender. Preston moved quickly to collect their weapons, keeping his own rifle trained on the group. "Tie them up," he told Penny, nodding toward some rope one of the ambushers had been carrying, presumably to bind Preston and Penny once they were captured. With practiced efficiency, Penny secured the three men to separate trees, tight enough to ensure they couldn't escape but not so tight as to cause injury. Justice, not vengeance, was their goal. What now? She asked when the task was complete, her face flushed with exertion and the aftermath of danger. "Our horses are gone, so are your saddlebags with the evidence." Preston's heart sank at the reminder. All their effort and risk might be for nothing if they couldn't recover those saddlebags. "The horses would have continued down the trail toward Elk Valley," he reasoned. "If we move quickly, we might catch them before they wander too far. And if we don't, then we still head for Miller's Crossing," Preston decided. Even without the physical evidence, our testimony about Carson's operations and this ambush will count for something with Judge Harrington. They gathered what supplies they could from their captives' ammunition, food, canteens of water, and prepared to continue their journey. Before leaving, Preston addressed Jenkins one final time. "We're going to leave you here," he said evenly. Someone will probably come looking for you eventually, or maybe not. Carson doesn't strike me as the type to waste resources on failed operations." Jenkins glared but said nothing, his wounded pride apparently as painful as his injured shoulder and wrist. "I should kill you for what you did to my father," Penny said quietly, standing before Jenkins with her rifle held loosely at her side. 2 years I've wondered who actually pulled the trigger. Was it you?" A flicker of something recognition, perhaps even remorse, crossed Jenkins' face before his expression hardened again. "Business is business, Nash, nothing personal." Penny's knuckles whitened on the rifle for a moment before she deliberately turned away. "You're not worth the bullet," she said simply, moving to join Preston at the edge of the clearing. They left the ambushers bound but alive, choosing justice over vengeance despite the temptation to settle scores permanently. As they made their way down the trail toward Elk Valley, Preston found himself watching Penny with new admiration. Her strength wasn't just in her ability to survive or fight, but in her capacity to hold onto her humanity, even in the face of those who had taken everything from her. The trail descended steeply, switchbacking down the mountainside toward the valley floor. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, aware that time was critical both for recovering their horses and for reaching Miller's Crossing before Carson could organize another ambush. About an hour into their descent, Penny suddenly raised her hand, signaling Preston to stop. "Listen," she whispered. At first, Preston heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of the forest. Then, faintly, came the distinctive sound of a horse nickering. "This way," Penny said, leaving the trail to follow a game path that led toward a small meadow visible through the trees. They emerged from the forest to find a welcome sight, both their horses grazing peacefully in the meadow, apparently having decided that fresh grass was preferable to continued panic-stricken flight. The saddlebags were still attached to Preston's mount, the precious evidence secure within. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see a pair of ornery horses," Preston said with relief as they approached the animals carefully, not wanting to startle them into another run. Penny smiled, reaching out to stroke her horse's neck as she took hold of its reins. "Pa always said horses have more sense than people give them credit for. These two knew exactly where the best grazing was." With their mounts and supplies recovered, their spirits rose considerably. They continued down toward Elk Valley at a much faster pace, now able to ride instead of walk. By late afternoon, they had reached the valley floor and were making good time along the trail to Miller's Crossing. The small settlement came into view just as the sun was beginning to set, little more than a collection of rough buildings gathered around the stage route that connected the more established towns in the territory. The stagecoach station was the largest structure, a 2-story wooden building that also served as the town's only hotel and telegraph office. Preston and Penny approached cautiously, aware that word of their escape from Jenkins' ambush might have reached Carson by now. The settlement appeared peaceful enough, a few locals moving between buildings, a wagon being loaded outside the general store, smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge. "Hollister will be in the station office," Penny said, nodding toward the main building. "If he's still the same man my father trusted, he'll help us." They dismounted in front of the station, tying their horses to the hitching rail. Preston kept his newly acquired rifle handy, unwilling to be caught unprepared again. The evidence from his saddlebags was now secured inside his shirt, close to his body where it couldn't be easily taken. The station office was empty except for an older man with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard, bent over a ledger at the desk. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening in recognition when he saw Penny. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, rising from his seat. "Penny Nash, thought you were determined never to leave that mountain of yours." "Circumstances changed, Mr. Hollister," Penny replied, a genuine smile warming her face for the first time in days. "This is Preston Cole. He works for Judge Harrington in Helena." Hollister's eyebrows rose as he extended his hand to Preston. "Federal judge, isn't he?" "What brings his man out to our little corner of nowhere, William Carson?" Preston answered simply. Watching the older man's reaction carefully, Hollister's expression darkened immediately. "Figured it might be something like that. Carson's been throwing his weight around these parts for years now, even more so lately." He glanced between them, noting their trail-worn appearance and Preston's obvious injury. "You two look like you've had quite a journey." Quickly but thoroughly, Preston explained their situation, his investigation into Carson's activities. The ambush in Blackwater Canyon, Penny's rescue, the pursuit by Carson's men, and finally their narrow escape from Jenkins' trap. Throughout the recounting, Hollister listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly grave. "So you need to get word to Judge Harrington," he summarized when Preston finished. "And you need to do it before Carson realizes his men failed again and sends more after you." "Exactly," Preston confirmed. "Is the telegraph line working?" Hollister nodded. "It is, but there's a complication." He lowered his voice, though they were alone in the office. "Carson's bought himself some local influence. Sheriff Ridley over in Cooper Creek takes his orders directly from Carson these days, and he's got deputies stationed in most settlements in the county, including right here in Miller's Crossing." Penny's face fell. "Are you saying we can't trust the law here either?" "I'm saying we need to be smart about this," Hollister replied. "Deputy Simmons is due to make his evening rounds in about an hour. He'll check the station as part of his route. If he sees you two, he'll recognize you from the descriptions Carson's men have been spreading. So we need to send the telegraph and be gone before Simmons arrives," Preston concluded. Hollister shook his head. "Telegraph messages pass through Cooper Creek. Sheriff Ridley would see it immediately and alert Carson before Judge Harrington could even respond." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "No, we need a different approach. What do you suggest?" Penny asked. "The eastbound stage arrives in about 30 minutes, Hollister said, checking the large clock on the wall. "It's continuing on to Fort Benton tonight, then connecting to Helena tomorrow." He smiled slightly. "I happen to know the driver, Sam Miller, hates Carson almost as much as you do, Miss Nash. Your father helped his brother out of a tight spot some years back." Understanding dawned on Preston. "He could carry a message directly to Judge Harrington." "Better than that," Hollister replied. "He could carry you at least as far as Fort Benton. From there, you'd be beyond Carson's immediate reach." It was the best option they had, given the circumstances. Preston and Penny used the time before the stage's arrival to clean up as best they could in the washroom Hollister provided, then wrote out a detailed statement about Carson's activities and the attempts on their lives, which could be sent ahead to Judge Harrington in case anything happened to prevent their personal testimony. "What about our horses?" Penny asked as they prepared for the stage's arrival. "I'll see they're taken care of," Hollister promised. "My son can bring them along to Fort Benton in a few days once things cool down." The stage rolled into Miller's Crossing right on schedule, 6 tired passengers disembarking for a meal break while fresh horses were hitched to the coach. Sam Miller, the driver Hollister had mentioned, proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with a perpetual squint and tobacco-stained mustache. After a brief, hushed conversation with Hollister, Miller approached Preston and Penny where they waited in the shadows beside the station. "Heard you two have been giving William Carson a run for his money," he said without preamble, his voice a gravelly rumble. "It'd be my genuine pleasure to help with that endeavor." "We appreciate the risk you're taking," Preston replied sincerely. Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "No risk I ain't willing to take to see that bastard get what's coming to him. Your daddy was a good man, Miss Nash. What happened to him wasn't right." With the arrangements made, they prepared to board the stage as soon as the other passengers returned from their meal. Hollister kept watch for Deputy Simmons, who would be starting his rounds soon. As they waited for the signal to board, Preston found himself facing an unexpected wave of emotion. Despite the danger and hardship of the past days, there was something about this moment that felt like an ending not just of their journey, but of the strange, intense bubble of time in which he and Penny had come to mean so much to each other. What happens after Helena? He asked quietly, voicing the question that had been growing in his mind. After Carson is brought to justice? Penny looked up at him, her hazel eyes reflecting the same uncertainty he felt. I don't know, she admitted. My home is probably gone by now. Carson's men wouldn't have left it standing after what happened. You could rebuild, Preston suggested, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was what either of them truly wanted. I could, Penny agreed softly. Or. She let the word hang between them, filled with possibilities neither had dared to voice until now. I've been thinking, Preston said carefully. Judge Harrington has connections throughout the territories. Once this business with Carson is settled, he could help secure a land grant. Anywhere you wanted to start over? And you? Penny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Would you go back to hunting outlaws for the judge? Preston took her hands in his, suddenly certain of what he wanted in a way he hadn't been for years. I was thinking I might try ranching instead. If I had the right partner, someone who knows the land, who's not afraid of hard work or facing down the occasional threat. He smiled slightly. Someone who's a better shot than me and twice as brave. A slow smile spread across Penny's face, transforming it with a joy Preston hadn't seen before. That sounds like quite a partnership, she said, her eyes never leaving his. It could be, Preston agreed, his heart racing with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider before meeting her. If you were interested. Penny's answer was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him deeply, her arms sliding around his neck as his encircled her waist. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Hollister's amused voice broke the moment. Stage is ready, he announced, eyes twinkling. And Deputy Simmons just rode into town, so I suggest you two continue this discussion on your way to Fort Benton. Moving quickly but casually, they boarded the stage, taking seats near the back where they would be less visible to anyone glancing inside. The other passengers, a middle-aged couple, a traveling salesman, and two miners headed for new claims, paid them little attention, tired from their own journeys and uninterested in new arrivals. As the stage pulled away from Miller's Crossing, Preston caught a glimpse of a man in a deputy's badge just turning the corner onto the main street. They had escaped discovery by mere minutes. The stage rattled along the rough road, swaying and jolting its passengers with every rut and stone. As darkness fell outside the windows, lanterns were lit inside the coach, casting a warm glow over the cramped interior. Penny sat close beside Preston, her head eventually coming to rest on his shoulder as fatigue overcame her. Preston remained alert, watching the passing landscape for any sign of pursuit, one hand resting protectively on the evidence still secured inside his shirt. But as the miles rolled away beneath the stage's wheels, taking them farther from Carson's immediate reach, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually succeed not just in bringing Carson to justice, but in finding a future neither had imagined possible just days before. The journey to Fort Benton passed without incident, the stage arriving shortly after dawn. From there, they transferred to a riverboat that would carry them the final leg to Helena, where Judge Harrington awaited their evidence and testimony. Standing on the deck of the boat as it churned its way upriver, Preston and Penny watched the wild Montana landscape slide past a territory still untamed in many ways, filled with both danger and possibility. The rising sun bathed everything in golden light, promising a new day and perhaps a new beginning. I've been thinking about what you said, Penny said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, about starting over, a ranch somewhere. Preston turned to her, hoping his expression didn't reveal just how much her answer meant to him. And a smile touched Penny's lips, her copper hair glinting in the morning sunlight. I think we'd make good partners, Preston Cole, in ranching and other ventures. Relief and joy surged through him. He drew her close, uncaring of the other passengers who might observe them. Is that a yes, Penny Nash? She looked up at him, hazel eyes clear and certain. That's a yes, but on one condition. Name it, Preston replied immediately. We name our first horse after the one that saved your life, Penny said, her expression serious but eyes dancing with humor. Whiskey seems fitting, don't you think? Preston laughed, the sound surprising him with its freedom and joy. Whiskey it is, he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as the riverboat carried them toward justice. And beyond that, to a future they would build together in the wild heart of Montana.